So good morning all, and Yumalundi, welcome. I'm Anne Evans, President of the Australian Population Association. What a challenging year this has been, and a really disappointing one for us as the Population Association, because we've had to cancel our biennial conference this year. So this is the opportunity we get to meet, we get to talk and see everyone from around the country every 2 years. But we're really grateful that our conference organising team, led by Edith Gray, has planned this series of fabulous seminars and panels to keep us engaged in all things population this year. Thank you to you. To start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I sit, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and thank them for their continued custodianship of this beautiful land. I also acknowledge all First Nations people joining us today during a COVID-delayed NAIDOC week. It is fitting that at this time, we open our series with our plenary presentation on Indigenous Data sovereignty. It gives me great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Professor Maggie Walter. Maggie is Palawa, a member of the larger Briggs-Johnson Tasmanian Aboriginal family, and is a distinguished professor of sociology at the University of Tasmania. For the past 5 years, she has worked as the inaugural Pro-Vice-Chancellor Aboriginal Research and Leadership at that university. As a sociologist, Maggie's research has focused on race relations, inequality, and research methods. At the centre of Maggie's intellectual passion are Indigenous statistics and data. She is a founding member of the Mayam Nairi Wingara Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective and the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. She has published extensively on the use of data on Indigenous people and will be sharing her knowledge and insights with us today. Yumalundi Maggie.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Edith and the Australian Population Association for inviting me along today. Happy NAIDOC week to everybody. So I will just start with an acknowledgement in Palawakani. So, Yapalingana, Mina, Maggie Walter, Mina, Palawa, Luchuwita. Wisi, Waranti, Kani, Mapali, Milathina, Mina, Tunapri, Palawa, Nigumpi, Takara, Mukaminya, Milathina, Nika. So, my name is Maggie Walter. I want to acknowledge that we're meeting on Aboriginal land. I'm here on Palawa land, so I pay my respects to the Palawa people, the traditional owners of this country, its skies and waterways, and pay honour to our elders past, present and emerging. Okay, I'm going to have an attempt to share my screen now and hope this all goes well. It does. So let's start. Oh, go back one. Oh, I forgot to, hang on folks, I forgot to bring my screen, my keyboard across. Here we go. Now, I've titled my presentation today, Indigenous Data Sovereignty, Rejecting the Hopeless, Helpless and Hapless Data Narrative. And I want to pay my respects to my esteemed Quandamooka colleague, Dr. Karen Martin, who has that term, hopeless, helpless and useless, I've just slightly modified as a way of expressing what population statistics around Indigenous statistics currently are. So in the first part of the presentation today, I'm going to overview the reasons for Indigenous data sovereignty, the need for those, and also the basic principles. But I'm not going to spend too long on that because I know that most of you in the audience will have had at least some idea and some reading about Indigenous data sovereignty in the past. So I don't want to keep reiterating the same thing. What I'm really going to be concentrating on is how do you do it and how you actually bring it into either existing and new data sets. And my challenge, I guess, to the audience, because all of you are working in the population statistics field, is to actually challenge the data that we are given in Australia, to actually speak up and say, these data, the current range of data we're getting are not enough. They're too focused on the deficit. They're not providing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, communities and organisations with the data that they need, that we need for our own nation rebuilding. And to just question the status quo. And we really need to do something active in Australia because other countries are moving on this and Australia just isn't. So we'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, so just to introduce myself a little bit, this is me. I come from this northeast nation here, as do nearly all Aboriginal people in Tasmania, because the only survivors of colonisation were women, the offspring of women who were kidnapped by sealers. So that's my patriarch, Manalagena there, who's also the patriarch of most Tasmanian Aboriginal people. That's my grandmother, Darrumpulgowa, and that's my dad. So there's a lot happening in the Indigenous data space at the moment. So we've got the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which has sort of been a bit sort of hanging around doing nothing much since it was sort of ratified in 2009, but more recently has started appearing in different documents, and is now starting to cut through. We've got the Coalition of the Peaks Memorandum of Understanding with COAG around, and also the refresh of the closed gap targets. We've now got 16. We've got the proposal for an Indigenous voice to Parliament for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have a say in the legislation and policy and programs that affect us and our communities. We've got the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people came together to re-articulate the same message that has been put out in various forms since really the 1830s with the work from coming out of Flinders Island. We've got the Empowered Communities model, which is a new way of governments and Indigenous communities interacting. And what all of these things have in common is they all need data. All of them need data to actually show, to actually be put into place, and they need data to actually see how they're working. So just as a bit of a reminder, when I talk about Indigenous data, I mean all data. So mostly today, we're going to be talking about population data, and that's appropriate. And that's the place where I am most comfortable, being with statistics and population statistics. But it needs to be stressed that Indigenous data are any knowledge or information in any format, inclusive of statistics that Indigenous people, that relate to Indigenous people and that impacts Indigenous lives at the collective and or individual level. So it's all. And that's with our work around Indigenous data sovereignty, we are now moving, we focused in on population statistics, but it's now going much, much wider. So it's information, it's data about our resources, our environments, our land history, geological, titles, water, seas, rivers. It's the data about us that we're mostly going to be using today, and also the data from us, which is around our archives, our traditional knowledges, our oral literature, our contemporary knowledges. So when you think data, think wider. So the first point I really want to stress, and I know most people listening in will have heard this before, data are not neutral. Just because they're in numeric form does not make them neutral, but they seem neutral because they seem to be numbers, and numbers, unlike words, don't seem to have any sort of socio-cultural meaning hanging off them, but they do, because they're reflections of something else. They're not just a number. So they are socio-cultural artifacts, and they reflect the social and cultural realities of those whose purposes they serve. And up to including the present moment, the purposes and who Indigenous data serve are not Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So mostly what we're seeing is the information that governments think they need to know, that it is important to know about us. So again, when you're looking at Indigenous data, think about whose purposes they're serving and why. And they've got sort of three main my critique of them is around three main parts. So I've got a bigger critique, which we'll come to in a moment, is they tend to always be a pejorative portrayal. So it's always about a story about Aboriginal people deficit. It's a national narrative of who we are, and it's not a very flattering one. I was thinking about it the other day, and I was thinking it's a bit like you're living in a neighbourhood and there's a big flash house next to you and you've got new neighbours moving in and you know these people are going to be around for a long time and you'd like to make a good impression and get on well with them. But you also know that as soon as they get to the house, they're going to be delivered a bit of a dossier on you. And all it's going to talk about is the time that your brother got drunk and threw up over the fence, the time that you shoplifted when you were 15, any sort of marital problems you've had. You're stymied from the start. You're never going to have a good relationship when that's the only story they've got of you. And that's one of the problems about when we're trying to look at reconciliation. If the only indigeny that non-Indigenous people know is the statistical indigeny, then they've just got that nasty pejorative narrative of who we are. And it also limits the possibility of any other ways for us to be known. Indigenous statistics are always simplistically presented and undemanding in their analysis. So they're one point in time, they're repeat cross-sectional data, they're in frequency counts or bivariate tables, and simplistic undemanding analysis leads to simplistic undemanding interpretations. Go back to the pejorative portrayal. And we also have what I call the orthodoxy of the dichotomy. By this I mean that you rarely see any data in Australia where the Indigenous data is not compared to non-Indigenous. So the race people are compared to the non-Indigenous people who evidently have no race, and it's always to our detriment. You wonder why we have to be constantly compared to others to make sense of our data. Okay, so there's also a lot going on in the Indigenous research space, which is going to impact Indigenous statistics, mostly in a positive way. So again, we've got the coalition of the peaks and the 16 new targets, which all are going to require different data that are currently being collected to actually answer those questions of whether those 16 targets are being met. And the fourth key priority out of 4 of the COAG agreement with the Coalition of the Peaks is data. We've got the Australian New Zealand Social Research Classification Review 2020, which is now out and active, in which we have now, for the first time ever, a 2-digit Indigenous division. So previous to this, Indigenous data were always, for the field of research or the SEO codes, were always at the 6-digit level. The problem there being, one of the many problems, is that no data were collated at the 6-digit level. It was always at the 2, the division and the field level, which means we had no way as an Australian society or as an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander society and population of knowing what research was being done, how much money was being spent, in what areas this research was being undertaken, who was doing it, or if we were getting value for money as taxpayers or as populations. And those things are not mutually exclusive. And this will have an impact beyond what you would think, because it flips around the paradigm. So instead of being an educational researcher who's researching on Indigenous students, you now are an Indigenous researcher or Indigenous issues researcher looking at education, and it completely flips it. And that flip will make a big difference. We've also got the newly released IAPSIS Code of Ethics for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So this is a big departure from the previous JURAs or the NH and MRC guidelines, in the fact that it isn't guidelines, it's a code, and they cover a whole lot of territory that moves away from the previous versions, which tended to be around the Anthro model, which was that the presumption that Indigenous research was always working with Indigenous communities. And somehow so statistical research was almost totally outside the previous guidelines. This one, the code, very much understands population data and the ethics around it. We've got the Indigenous Evaluation Strategy that's been released by the Indigenous Productivity Commissioner, Commissioner Romney Mokak, which again will be asking for evidence that policy and programs are actually effective, that it will be not enough just to say that these things are well intentioned. We've got the open data and sharing principles legislation that's coming, and I'll talk a little bit more about that and the problems with that. We've got the Myamnari Wingara Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective, which is working, we have been working since 2016 to bring these issues to the fore and to make change. We don't want to just talk about it, we want change. And as part of Myamnari Wingara is part of the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and the Global Indigenous Data Alliance has released the CARE principles, which are to be matched with the FAIR principles. So most of you on the call here this morning will know the FAIR principles that have been rolled out around data around the world, the protocols. So the idea is not to replace FAIR, but say that if you are working in the Indigenous space, you need to be both fair and to care. I'll look at those a little bit more just at the end of our session. All right, so let's just review, and I'm sure some of you have seen me talk about this before, but the current context, which is also known as the art of getting it wrong for all the wrong reasons. So we've got an Indigenous data paradox in Australia and in most other Anglo nation states, but particularly Australia, and I'll talk about the particular problems in Australia in a moment. So we've got too much of what I call badder data. So that's data which is blameworthy in how it's presented. It infers some sort of complicity. So this is about alcohol and drug abuse. As you can see, it follows the standard orthodoxy of the dichotomy, whereas Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are compared pejoratively with non-Indigenous people. It's a very simplistic presentation. The thing here is not whether these figures are actually correct. We know that we have a lot of drug and alcohol issues in our communities. It's about why somebody who was putting this paper together decided that this was the thing that they wanted to highlight on the page. So charts don't make themselves, data doesn't analyse itself. Somebody makes decisions about what's going to be analysed, what's going to be highlighted. And we see these sorts of charts all over the place. It's aggregate. It's always, like this one, isn't national. So if I'm down here in Palawa country in the Greater Hobart area, how useful is this chart to me to know that nationally, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in age 35 to 45 are much more likely to have alcohol and drug problems? Absolutely useless. But it does serve a narrative purpose about who Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are. So this is what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia looks like. It isn't national, yet we do not have any data that answers the questions that we want to know based on our First Nations. We've asked for it, we haven't yet got it. It's always decontextualised. So in its simplistic presentation, it's always about what, never why. So this is about smoking rates. Again, it's national. Again, it's comparing Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Again, it's just split up by age groups. And again, it is showing Indigenous people in the pejorative. Yes, more Aboriginal people are smoking. Why? Why are there such big rates? Can we not say no to a cigarette? Or is there something a little bit deeper? The answer is we don't know because we're not asking. Well, some of us are. I'll refer to the work of Professor Ray Lovett. It's also what I call 5D data. It focuses on our disparities, on our difference, on our disadvantage, on our dysfunction, and overall on deficit. So this is about incarceration rates. This one's broken up by state. But if you have a look at the Western Australia and Northern, well, everywhere, and you're screaming why. Yet the answers to that are very, very, well, these data are presented often without answers. And it's reductive. So this is school rates. It's always about as if you can plug Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in as one half of a dichotomous variable. So plug it into your model, plug in race, and then see what comes up. But our lived realities are much, much more complex than that. You can't just plug us in, especially when all the data you're plugging this dichotomous variable into is all about deficit. The answer will always be our deficit. It can't be anything else. Now, this pattern is global in Anglo-colonised nations. So here's one from the US, I think. Yep, around suicide. Oops, wrong button there. Oh, press it again, I think. Anyway, I'll press, no, I can't seem to get out of it. Where am I? Wrong, okay. This one is from New Zealand, I know this is from Canada, looking at average education scores. This one's from New Zealand about life expectancy. But I want to make the point here that these sorts of charts that I'm showing you from, especially from Canada and New Zealand, are becoming much harder to find. So the traditional trope of Indigenous statistics in those places is actually being disrupted and change is occurring. So for example, just last week, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern announced her new cabinet. In that new cabinet is an assistant minister, a Maori woman, who actually has responsibility for Indigenous statistics. And within her purview is Indigenous data sovereignty. Australia, nothing. So we're a real laggard here, and the hanging on to that old trope of simplistic orthodoxy of the dichotomy and pejorative is hanging on fast. And that's what I want to challenge you to do, to challenge that and say, it's time to move on. We need something better. And just to really make my point, I did some research a few years ago where I looked at all the formal government inquiries that had been into Aboriginal disadvantage. And the earliest one I found was from the colony of Victoria in 1858, the Select Committee inquiry into the present condition of the Aborigines of this colony and the best means of alleviating their wants. I was struck when reading yet another Overcoming Indigenous Disadvantage report from the Productivity Commission that apart from the change of language, the whole frame of reference within which these two reports are written is exactly the same. Nothing has changed. So we've got 160 odd years of doing the same thing and with no outcomes. So the real issue here is, why do we keep doing that? Why do we keep doing the same thing even though we know it doesn't work? So just to bring in a little bit of theory here, some political science from Scott. Scott very much in his book Seeing Like a State, and it wasn't about Indigenous issues, it was more broader than that. He points to 4 elements that you need if you want to create a social policy disaster of truly epic proportions. And they're Scott's words, and I think they're wonderful words. He said the first thing, and the base thing that you have to do is you have to have an administering ordering to make society legible. So modern societies are too complex. They're not villages, they're feudal nation states with millions and millions of citizens. How do you make that society understandable to those who are making the rules and the policy? You have to transform them into something that's understandable. And we use national statistics, population statistics, to do that. And what you get is a transformative simplification of social realities and environments. And that's very much what we've got in Indigenous statistics. Huge simplifications and a real failure to understand social realities because those who are collecting them aren't those people who are living it. You've got to have a high modernist ideology. Now, I think here, that sort of Scott's terminology is a little bit old-fashioned, but it refers very much, I think, to the current unfettered enthusiasm that we have in our governments for open data and around the world, open data and big data. that somehow these are going to solve all the problems. We just need to open up our data and let fresh eyes in to look at it all, and we need to link all our data sets, and then we'll come up with the solutions to difficult problems. But we've still got the same variables, so we can't come up with any different solutions or any different answers. We want different answers, we have to have different data. The authoritarian state for number 3, and a society that lacks the capacity to resist. And I'm going to refer to another theorist here because these things go, both Scott and Hirschman's work, I think for me, go hand in hand. So Hirschman talks about Fracasomania, and I think that's one of my favourite words. It's Spanish, and he referred to it when he was doing work for the World Bank in Colombia in the 1950s. And what he was struck by was this sort of pattern of behaviour that always led to the same consequence. It just went round and round and round, which meant that none of the work that the World Bank was doing there was actually having any impact. So he came up with these 6 things that he said that you have this Fracasomania, which is a policy mindset, which has made a comfortable adjustment to policy failure. And if you think about the Closing the Gap, the last 10 years of it, there is a comfortable adjustment. We've now refreshed it, but it took 10 full years of failure. No heads rolled, nothing happened. People just said, hopeless, helpless and hapless, what can we do? We'll try again. So Hirschman's things are that the solutions emanate from those outside the community defined as having a problem. We said that very much in Indigenous policy and how the data are used. He said the motivation to solve the policy always moves ahead of the understanding of the problem. So people are jumping in with solutions before there's actually been any real interrogation of what the problem is. He said there's an inability to build a cumulative knowledge in relation to the problem, so it's just always starting again. And it's driven by this urgency to solve the problem, even though the problem is usually long-standing. So you've got to do things now. You can't wait. He said every policy failure is then followed by an insistence that the policy was a complete failure, and then there's an insistence that you start again without learning from the previous experience. So that's what I think we have in Australia around Indigenous policy and programs, and Indigenous population data is a big contributor to that. So if you're working in the field, have a think about whether you're contributing, you're undermining or contributing to Fracasomania. And let's move on now to big data and open data. There is a presumption that it equals better data. So this is a real problem, and it's a real risk, huge risk for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the policy space and also in the lived reality space. These things have real impacts on people's lives. So we know when you open up data that you open it and you're going to we're going to be overrepresented in the data of disadvantage. We're already also going to be a curiosity. So when people get data and they're data mining, they say, what can we look at? Let's compare the Indigenous and non-Indigenous. That will be a go-to because we already see it happening. If you want to see what open data looks like and the risk, have a look at the Queensland Government Open Data Portal. I went in there recently and found a data set that talks about, that actually lists people's alcohol and drug treatments by case. Hasn't got their name, but it may as well do, because it lists whether they're Aboriginal, whether they're Torres Strait Islander, whether they're Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. It lists everything with their male and female. It lists their age range. It lists their postcode, and it also lists all of their treatments that they got. So I think it would take about 3 phone calls for me to quickly identify any person on that list that is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. Number 2, the big risk is we're already alienated from the data. It's all sitting in agencies which have non-Indigenous governance, and the open data and big data just pushes those people who are the subject or the object of that data further away. It's been used in predictive algorithms in social programs. I think it's in New South Wales at the moment. It's certainly been used in New Zealand, with the consequence, not surprisingly, that even though they didn't put a racial identifier, an Indigenous identifier in the algorithms, Maori families were still heavily overrepresented in those families that were identified to be at risk for intervention. Our capacity to actually benefit from any of the open data, so I'm not against open data or big data, I'm against open data and big data that does not take Indigenous issues and Indigenous data rights into consideration. It just presumes that somehow it's going to work out okay. And of course, why wouldn't they? It's not their children, it's not their communities, it's not their peoples who are at risk. You can just say, like you always do, oh, well, it didn't work. Hapless, hopeless, and helpless. So the problem here we've got is that many of the discussion papers coming out about open data do not contain the term Indigenous at all. We have made, as the Maori Wingara Data Collective, we have made submissions, and there is talk around recognising now so that there are specific Indigenous issues, but there seems to be a frozenness here, as if somehow we can't move forward, that we can recognise the issue, but that we don't seem to have any other model except the old trope of 5D data. So I would say to all of those people and to everybody, if you're going to be working in this field, you need an Indigenous cultural and social licence. You cannot just go in there without the skill set with good intentions. It's no longer good enough. All right, so let's move on. That's the growly part of the lecture. Let's move on to how Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance might work. So the question we ask when we want to think about this is, what would it look like if it was Indigenous statistics versus statistics about Indigenous peoples? So what would Indigenous population data look like if we were the instigators, analysers and intended audience? Wouldn't look like it does now. What would it look like if the data were collected and analysed to meet our needs, priorities and aspirations? Wouldn't look like it does now. And what would it look like if the data were framed around what Indigenous peoples define as important to know about ourselves? Again, it would not look like it looks like now. So this is from the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network. But the same issues are occurring everywhere, except some nation states are doing something about it, where we're looking to move from a situation of data dependency, which is the current situation, through the two paths of decolonising data, but also Indigenous data governance. So keeping in mind, there's always those twin things, and you'll see I'll come back to those twin things through all the next part of the lecture. So let's first define Indigenous data sovereignty. So it is the right of Indigenous peoples to govern the collection, management, interpretation, dissemination and reuse of data related to them. So it is not an adjustable or an approximate. This is the definition. So if it's not doing this, it's not Indigenous data sovereignty. That doesn't mean we can't do approximation, well, moves towards it that don't quite meet it. But please don't call it Indigenous data sovereignty unless it actually meets that criteria. So it relates to all data about Indigenous peoples, country and resources, or has a significant impact on these. It reaffirms our obligations to respect our knowledge and data and to recognise data as belonging to the collective, not just the individual. It's premised on data accountability to Indigenous peoples as per the United Nations Declaration for the Right of Indigenous Peoples. And it demands that data reflect our priorities and it actually be used to enhance Indigenous collective wellbeing as defined by Indigenous people. Now, this is a global definition. Wording's very slightly because of the different things happening within nation states, but this is the agreed global definition. So how you do it is it's about governance. So now moving to the other side of the Indigenous data paradox, the fact that we've got too little data. I'll come to those in a minute, but I just want to focus in on the bottom here. Consultation or an advisory group is not governance. So we have had consultations and advisory groups for 40 years without any, I haven't seen anything that's ever come out of those things. So it seems to be more going through the process, and increasingly we're encouraging people to say no to be on a consultation or advisory group, because it is just, unless we're in the decision making, it is really just using our energies. So we want data that reflects Indigenous life worlds. We want data that's at the level needed by our First Nations and our communities. We want data that's defined on Indigenous defined priorities and needs. We want data that contributes directly to our nation rebuilding efforts. And we want data that are accountable to and controlled by those to whom they relate. And it would just seem common sense that these are the sort of data that you would be giving if you did want to see Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people meet their aspirations and needs and to nation rebuild. Okay, so Indigenous data sovereignty is global. So we have the Tamana Maori Data Sovereignty Network in New Zealand, Indigenous United States Network, the Maiara Wingara Network, the First Nations Indigenous Data Governance Group have just recently joined the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. So we have these two international networks of networks, and also the RDA, International Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group, who are holding their plenaries this week. And we have new emerging Indigenous data sovereignty collectives in Inuit, Métis, First Nations in Canada, Sami across the Scandinavian nations, and the Polar nations, and also in Mexico and in the Basque region in Spain. So, when we're talking about Indigenous data governance, we're talking about a two-way understanding of governance. So this, the sort of governance of data and data for governance comes from the work of Diane Smith, and I'd like to acknowledge that, from ANU, who coined this term, and it's now used globally, and it's a very neat way of summing up the two arms that you have to have for Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance to be effective. So you want governance of existing data and data that are collected about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we need to be able to refute that 5D data of disregard. We need to be able to tell our own stories, and we need to be able to apply Indigenous data protocols. On the data for governance, we need data to actually have governance within our own communities, to build those strong governance systems. So we need them to inform our policy and programs, to develop our own data infrastructure. That's a really big need. We need the one central place to develop our own data infrastructure, to keep all these data sets. And we need to be able to design and deploy our own indicators and measures. So that's how you get Indigenous data sovereignty. And just to hammer home that message, so you've got these three groups. You've got scholars, you've got the community sector and our institutions all coming together around Indigenous data sovereignty. It's not a scholarly exercise per se, although there is a lot of scholarship in the field. It's an advocacy and an action endeavour. And these are the four main things that we do. So to date, we're supporting data governance and First Nations data capacity. So we're out in our own community, we're supporting that capability. We're initiating and participating in the initiatives globally. We're promulgating Indigenous data governance protocols and processes as per today. And we're advocating for Indigenous data governance practices within public and private sector. And that's where you guys come in, because you need, it can't just be us. There's too few of us and our voice is too small. We need everybody to be in there advocating for Indigenous data governance practices. So to pull some of this together in Australia, back in June 2018, seems like a world away, doesn't it? We actually organised an Indigenous Data Sovereignty Summit with some of our Maori colleagues who came in to support us, and we also were co-run with the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute at ANU. And we had more than 50 people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, leaders from around Australia come. And this was the key outcomes around Indigenous data that came out of that, what we issued in a protocol. So that we have the right to exercise control of the data ecosystem. We have the right for data that is contextual and disaggregated. We have the right to data that is relevant and empowers. We have a right for accountability for data stewardship and structures. And we have a right to data that is protective and respects our individual and collective interests. Again, I don't think it's too much to ask. Yet we need to have a paradigm shift to actually move from that 5D data to this type of data. Now, we've been reasonably successfully globally. So the right to privacy, most definitely, is the report of the Special Rapporteur to the United Nations included recommendations that were specific around Indigenous data sovereignty and around Indigenous data. So this is coming at the global level. And just to sort of get to the final part of today's lecture, just to elaborate a little bit about the FAIR and the CARE. So the CARE is FAIR is findable, accessible, interpretable, interoperable rather, and reusable. And the CARE that has to be combined with that is collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And again, I don't think you'll find anything too radical in these. So collective benefit is about for inclusive development and innovation, for improved governance, for equitable outcomes. Authority to control is about Indigenous rights and interests, governance. Data for governance, governance of data. Responsibility is about ensuring those positive relationships, and that's and equitable relationships, not consulting. Expanding our capability and capacity, and for the inclusion of Indigenous language and worldviews within those. And the ethics, really just the standard ethics, so minimising harm and maximising benefit for justice and for future use. So here's my final slide. Walaka, that's thank you, in Palawakani. I've got the websites up there for both the Maori Wingara and also the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. And two sources if you want to find out more. So the original, possibly the best, original data sovereignty book, which was put out in 2016 by ANU Press, edited by the wonderful Tahu Kukutai and John Taylor, which was the impetus behind the whole movement. So it brought together Indigenous people from around the globe to talk about Indigenous data sovereignty as a brand new concept. That's available for free download, and it's been downloaded many, many, many thousands of times. The other book, Indigenous Data Sovereignty and Policy, is a brand new one that's just out this month by Routledge. It's edited by myself, Tahu Kukutai, Stephanie Russo-Carroll and Desi Rodriguez-Lombard, and it's got 14 chapters from primarily Indigenous authors, talking about the link between Indigenous data sovereignty and policy. And that also should be downloadable free from Routledge. One of our editors had some money that she, in her research account, and actually purchased the open data rights from Routledge. So I'd encourage you to go and have a look at those if you want to know more. There's plenty on our websites. And I'd really encourage you to be part of the movement, to actually change the paradigm and the narrative around Indigenous data in Australia. And it will result in much better policy and programs and much better outcomes, which is for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maggie. There was so much in that, so much you know, historical overview of the problems and, you know, pointers for directions moving forward. So I'm going to open the floor for questions now. So I'd post in the chat, if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen, or put up your hand virtually, and I will allow you to speak, unmute you so that you can ask your question. While everyone's having a think about their questions and getting ready to post them, Maggie, I'd like you to talk a little bit about how, you know, thinking about different communities, different areas would have different ideas about what is appropriate data for them. And so under these principles, you know, you would be having different types of data collected from you know, different groups, different regions. What kind of structure do you think needs to be in place to allow that to happen? So the ABS, you know, exists and at the moment is responsible for collecting most of the population data. Is there a structure you think that the government can put in place to allow that to happen?
There isn't, but there should be. So we need an Indigenous data infrastructure, so that we actually need to have, at the moment, you know, with the change in the research classification codes, the code of ethics, the, you know, COED, all of these things are moving towards requiring a different type of data, but there's nothing really to connect them. So they're all just bits here and there. So we actually need to have a platform where that can be. And it's up to, you know, the fact that different communities will require different types of data is not an impediment. That's exactly what you would expect. The idea that somehow this national data is useful is shown to be you know, completely bogus. And it might be interesting for those who are looking at Aboriginal people, but it's certainly not useful to them or to us. So we need an infrastructure. How we get that, I mean, New Zealand has a much, much better model. But of course, New Zealand has a smaller population and far less diversity amongst their Indigenous population. So I'll probably get growled at for that, but they have the one language, for example. So I don't really mean to say they're not diverse, they are. So I think the first thing we need in Australia is actually to have a roundtable. We need to bring all the players, all the key stakeholders together. That would be the ABS, IATSIS, Lowitja, Mayamnori Wangara, the Indigenous Data Network, Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, and those other major agencies, and actually sit down and actually work out what we could do to actually create an infrastructure that would allow these sorts of data, the data that are needed to be produced. I don't think it's too hard. I think it's just a matter of people working together. I don't even think it would cost that much. It's about just sort of doing something rather than sort of saying, well, this is the data, these are the data we've got. What can you do?
Thanks. So there's a way forward. We just need to get.
I think so, and
yes.
I think it's not too hard. It's not too hard at all.
Okay, thanks. So I've got a couple of questions in the chat, which I'll ask for you first. So the first is from Minda. In fact, they're both from Minda. Maggie, wonderful insights. What do you see as the biggest obstacle or challenge to our mobs holding and using data about ourselves?
Well, there's a couple of challenges. The first is that the idea of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people having our own data and using it is sort of outside the way data, population data, have always been construed. It's always been the outsider we have been the objects under the lens of the data. The second thing is the lack of skills around data skills, around statistical literacy in many of our organisations and communities. So we needed to have a very concerted effort to actually bring those skill levels up so that people in these communities and organisations are both able to collect their own data and also challenge the data that are given. Because at the moment, the data are all one way. It's a big vacuum where data from community organisations is sucked up into government and there's almost no reciprocal return of data. So those two things, breaking the mould where it's the idea that we can do our own analysis, and second one, providing those skill sets to do that.
I'm just going to go to Steve McEachen now, who's got his hand up, and let him ask his question. So can you unmute now, Steve?
Yep, hopefully you can hear me now, Anne. Yep. So Maggie, I'm Director of the Australian Data Archive based at ANU as well. I'm very interested in the discussion on infrastructure because there's kind of different elements of that, and a conversation that's been going on with several departments over a number of years now, particularly in the research space with the Department of Education, that has had difficulty in actually articulating in two spaces. I mean, the department has tended to think of Indigenous data as being humanities, arts and social science, which is problematic in itself. But secondly, as I say, getting that group of people around the table, I think you're absolutely right as to how you go about that. And I guess the question I've got is, I mean, what actually constitutes the infrastructure here that kind of needs to be built? Is it data? Is it machines? Is it people? Is it governance? Like, how do we facilitate a conversation which I think includes all of those things?
Well, you're right, Steve. It does need to be all of those things. And look, I think I need to also reinforce here the first principle of Indigenous data sovereignty is Indigenous leadership. So, you might, for example, come up with some sort of deal between IATSIS and LOATCHA and Australian Institute of Health and Welfare or the ABS, that you could actually do a collaborative level of infrastructure. But you need machines, you need people, you need leadership, you need governance. The data is out there, and we also want much other data, the new data, but we need to actually have a place where it's stored, where it's available, and where the protocols around its use can be attached, so that, have metadata labels to actually make sure that sort of these data are not lost, but secondly, not misused. And, the data archive that you work with, I mean, you've got some principles there. We could learn from your experiences with sort of non-Indigenous data, but also bring in those Indigenous protocols as well. So it's a matter of working through it rather than sort of having immediate answers.
Yeah, no, I'd be interested in talking further about that. So that sounds good.
Thanks, I would too.
So Terry Hull asks a question, membership in Indigenous societies is alternatively a matter of individual identity and community acknowledgement. In the USA, there is often a formal tribal membership, but in the census, the count is purely individual identity claim. If there's conflict, how will custodians of the data resolve the matter?
It's not our problem to resolve. This is always brought up as somehow, because sometimes Indigenous identity can be contested, but it's pretty rare. Most people know who's in their community, but we're talking about population data here. We're not talking about sort of, it's about patterns. So a few people who being included who may not be always accepted in the community is not really going to change the pattern. So it doesn't seem to have made any difference with the population data that's been collected for, well, since the census, but certainly it was collected before. And there's other ways of doing it too, of course, is that we have been asking the ABS for many years to actually include a First Nations indicator in that question. So it wasn't Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who decided that that was the best question for the census. It was the ABS. We've questioned that ever since and said we want better questions. But contestability about identity is really, I don't want to come down too hard on this, but it seems to be a little bit of a red herring that's often thrown up as if sort of, oh, you can't do it because there are no lists and there's no tribal, sort of registers, etc., etc. But of course, those tribal registers in the US are now being contested themselves as being deeply problematic around identity. So it's not a simple issue, but it's not something either that actually derails the value of Indigenous data, Indigenous data governance or Indigenous data sovereignty.
Another question in the Q&A from Minda. What can government do to enable more data to be held by Indigenous groups? Governments have so much data. How do we transfer it?
Well, it's about access to data. So the trouble with happening now, we've got, and I know that this is a concern of Marcia Langton's group, the Indigenous Data Network, is that there are Indigenous data sets held all over the place, and I'm guilty of this as well. I've got some on my hard drive. When I retire, what happens to those? So they just, or somebody throws out my old hard drive when they disappear. So they need to be saved. But also, you know, obviously education department data that's collected about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students would probably stay with the education department. But we need access to that, and there needs to be governance within the education department, Indigenous data governance, to ensure that it's actually being used in a way that promotes Indigenous and student wellbeing. So at the moment, we have these huge amounts of data, which is just really locked away. They don't, as if collecting it is the aim rather than analysing it. You know, anybody who's tried to access ABS data will know how difficult it is to go beyond just the data cubes, when we really do need, if we want to do more in-depth analysis, we need to be able to do more than those sorts of things. So we need better access, and we need data holders to be open about returning and or Indigenous data governance, and also providing access.
The next question from Kim Johnstone. Thanks, Maggie. That was a great presentation. Any suggestions for how to engage bureaucrats on greater data sovereignty and engagement of Aboriginal peoples? I've had experience of being brought in to give data advice and then excluded when I kept saying we need to have Aboriginal people in the discussion before we progress.
Okay, this is where the power of no comes in, right? So we have to stop. It's like codependency, you know, it's buying the alcoholic a bottle of grog. We just have to stop enabling these departments and the bureaucrats, who often are well-intentioned, I know they are, but we have to stop the pattern of where they ask us for advice, we give it to them, they say, well, thank you very much, and then go away and reject that advice because it doesn't suit what they want. And then they write up that they've consulted with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So we need to be saying, we have to say no before we can say yes. So until we get a change in the way this is data are approached, it's time to say no. We don't want to come in and talk to you about data unless you can tell us what's going to change as a result of that. And I'll go out on a limb here a little bit and say the ABS currently are having consultations around the health survey and other bits and pieces, but they're not real consultations because the questions they're asking are very limited ABS defined questions. So they're asking, should we be able to collect genetic samples from under 18-year-olds? That's not the question. The question is, should the ABS be able to collect genetic samples from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children or anybody at all? So while it is still controlled, then it's not a proper consultation. It's just, it's window dressing. And really we have to start saying no and just not participating and allow the illusion of window dressing to go on.
So I've got a question here in the chat from Chika. Thank you very much for this powerful and thought-provoking lecture. As an Australian from another cultural geography, which is also a part of the voyeuristic 5D data usage, how can I participate in this process without becoming part of the problem?
Challenge the data. Don't accept the status quo. You certainly don't participate in it, but you can also challenge it. You can reject it, and to actually sort of say, you know, I'm just not going to do that. And the principles, Indigenous data sovereignty, I'm not going to speak for any other group, but I think they're principles really about human rights, and they can be applied to other groups other than Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but they have particular resonance with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people, because they're designed by us for us to address the particular problems we face globally. But it is just about human rights. Nobody should be the subject or the object of data without any say in what happens with that data and who uses it. Well, I saw that come up on the thing. So yes, if you want to learn, go to have a look at the Global Indigenous Data Alliance website, have a look at the Myram Nauru Wangara website, read those books. It will put you on a very different path. There's a huge amount of scholarship there from Indigenous scholars from all over the world contributing to this sort of big, broader advocacy and debate movement.
Okay, another question from Minda. I'm channeling Minda here to answer. What is the next big question to be answered in the journey to data sovereignty in Australia? Any advice for budding Indigenous scholars who want to add to the narrative in this space? Asking for a friend, haha.
Learn how to do stats. Do some stats course. You know, that's my big mantra is you must know the stats, because unless you know the stats, you know, and this is what happens to many of these data organisations. They have an advisory group, but nobody who actually understands stats. So when they say, oh, we should do that, they say, oh, no, we can't do that. Statistically, that's not possible. Whereas if you understand the stats, you can say statistically what you just said is rubbish. You know, just because you've asked a question in 4 previous surveys and it was a stupid question the first time it was asked, it didn't improve by being asked 4 times. So you've still got a rubbish question. So we must know the stats. So for budding Indigenous scholars, make sure you get on to do some courses. Do it at AXFRI, do some other things, really build up your statistical knowledge. We need many more Indigenous researchers in this statistical space.
Thanks, Maggie. I think that's you know, in terms of the Australian Population Association's mission too, to get greater awareness and understanding of data on people and how you use data on people. This is also an important point that you're making. Okay, so we've got no questions left in the Q&A, no hands up, no chat. Anyone got any other questions that have been rattling?
Look, I do encourage people to ask a question. I'm fairly strong on this stuff, and you shouldn't let that put you off. I think you should, you know, this is an open, equal debate, and we just need to have we need to have these open discussions, not be sort of tiptoeing around and saying, well, I couldn't ask that question, it might have been offensive. We need to just be sort of accepting that all of us have a view and it's worthwhile as talking about it.
Okay, Steve's got another question.
I'd left my hand down for a little bit because I could ask lots of questions. My question's around taking the governance model further.
Mm-hmm.
Most data collections that might exist are going to include data from, they're data from a large population of which Indigenous people are a part.
Yep.
How do you manage the governance of the Indigenous parts of that collection within the broader framework of custodianship more generally? Like, how do you articulate that in practice is what I'm really interested in as someone has to do this.
Okay, so as a rule of thumb, if the data set actually has an Indigenous identifier in it, it needs Indigenous data governance because that identifier will be used in analysis.
Mm-hmm.
If it has no Indigenous identifier, then you don't really need to worry because there's no way, probably, of actually sort of getting those simplistic sort of tables up which compare Indigenous with non-Indigenous population samples. So, but if it has an Indigenous identifier, it requires some Indigenous data governance protocols around how those data are used, especially around how that particular variable is used.
Okay. We've got a question here from Pat Core. Hi Maggie, thank you for your informative presentation. I had the good fortune to attend sorry, don't have my glasses on, INHKD conference in Washington State last decade.
Yep.
A cathartic experience for me on the need to change to greater engagement directly with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and their advocates on the demography statistics program. But there was a big gap between community aspiration and data governance readiness. How can we take bigger steps?
Well, again, it's a sort of an over to you question, as in we are working on the Indigenous side to get our side ready, but we can't move without willingness and a preparedness to change on the governance side. And this is a long-standing problem. The wonderful Megan Davis writes in that first Indigenous Data Sovereignty book about how the problems with data have been identified since at least the 1980s at the United Nations Declaration, Permanent Forum of Indigenous Peoples. So this is not new. Indigenous Data Sovereignty just gives a sort of a framework to those concerns and those issues. So I can't, either I would, go into the ABS tomorrow and flip the switch and get Indigenous data governance happening there, but I can't do that. So we actually need to have non-Indigenous leaders in the field, allies, to actually push this message and say, this is actually good for the nation. This is not just good for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This is good for the nation per se. This is something that we should do. We've got all the evidence is in. We've got 160 years of evidence to show what we're doing now doesn't work. So why would we keep doing that? So it is about leadership within those agencies and people actually saying, well, okay, let's change the paradigm. Let's have a go.
Okay, we have a follow-up to Steve's first question, I think, because it popped up as Steve was asking the second, so I think it's from the first question. In response to that question from Steve, Maggie, you said, it's not too hard at all.
Yeah.
Please flesh that out.
That's right. Sort of, I don't have a formula, but I do know some of the elements that have to be in it. It has to have Indigenous leadership. It has to have Indigenous capacity. It has to have the non-Indigenous agencies, which are the primary data custodians, at the table and willing to change, and also willing to build that infrastructure. So we need, I don't think it's that expensive. I think there's bits and pieces of it out there already, but we just need it to be connected all up and actually have a sort of, name it up and recognise it and say, well, okay, we now have an Indigenous data infrastructure and this is how we will work across the various platforms. So, AIHW and the ABS already work together. The open data movement is now bringing administrative data into that. So these elements are coming together to develop a larger Australian data infrastructure. We need to have an Indigenous data infrastructure that fits, not within that, but is aligned with that. So it really is working it all out. I don't have all the answers because I'm just an academic, I'm a sociologist at the University of Tasmania. But I think that if we bring the big minds to the table, then we can do something quite amazing. And we can look to places like Canada where the OCAC has been in for a while now, which again was Indigenous peoples in Canada, First Nations, when the Canadian government said, we're coming onto your reservation to do some health research, and they said, hell no, you're not. You're not coming on unless we have ownership of the data, we have control of the data, we have access to the data, and we decide what happens with the data. And that has made a huge difference, not perfect by any means, but in Canada, a huge difference. And the end result is that the data that they're getting is much, much, much better. And the same thing is happening in New Zealand. But it's not happening yet here in Australia. People still want to tinker around the edges without actually doing anything big. It's as if, I understand, game theory would say people are more afraid of the risk of loss than they are of gain. And I think for some of the non-Indigenous agencies, there is a fear of some sort of loss, but I don't think that fear is real. I don't think it would bear out. I think it would actually be a bigger and better role, and it would be a much more collaborative role, which would get about better outcomes in the end.
I've got a question from John Taylor. So John, you can unmute and speak now.
Thank you, Anne.
You're very, very faint, John. You might need to get closer to the microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Just responding to that question about, well, what sort of infrastructure is required. I mean, we were heading very much in this way under the ATSIC Regional Council structure. It was ATSIC who initiated the Community Housing and Infrastructure Needs Survey, which was jettisoned when ATSIC was jettisoned. We also had NatSIS data available at ATSIC Regional Council levels to come to Maggie's point about accessibility. So there are precedents for this sort of data infrastructure that governments just got rid of. So it's worth looking back at prior attempts at achieving some of this. The current model is embedded in the empowered communities model, but I'm not so sure that the data infrastructure requirements have been fully established there, but it's very much the intent to establish forms of data sovereignty at those regional levels. So there are working models around, and we just need to start looking more closely at them and see how they can be adapted. My point really is that governments can do this, but they just need the, the intent to do that. And currently that's not the case, but it has been the case in the past.
Thanks, John. You're absolutely right. And certainly when we look at things like the voice to Parliament, you know, we are going to have those that capacity to have data at that that regional level. And at the moment, we don't have the capacity for that.
We have another question in the Q&A from Janet McDougall, Data Archives. Janet asks, I'm interested in how skills within communities to manage Indigenous data, both statistical and non-statistical, can be built.
It's a big job, and we need to get out there and do it. I've just got an ARC grant where that is one of the aims of the ARC grant, is to actually provide skilling, including up to a graduate certificate of Indigenous data. Certainly at the Global Indigenous Data Alliance Executive, we've recently identified the need for a whole suite of everything from an afternoon workshop through to grade dips. And we'll be working together as a global group to actually establish those curricula, which are then adaptable to local levels. So they will be built around Indigenous methodologies and Indigenous protocols. And we will be, I know certainly in the US, it's one of the big pushes forward to actually get out into different organisations and upskill, and we're moving the same way in Australia. But again, it's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people doing it for ourselves, because we just can't wait. And there's a limited capacity, but we will do what we can because we won't wait.
Okay, no hands. Oh, Janet has said, I'm really interested to learn about solutions. Thank you. So, and I think, yeah, that new grant that you've got, Maggie, will go a long way to starting that process. So that's fantastic. Yeah. Any other questions?
And once it's developed, it perhaps can be rolled out in universities, as long as it still retains that Indigenous leadership. What we can't have is it being, that doesn't mean non-Indigenous people can't participate, including in the teaching, but it means it always needs to be under Indigenous leadership and collaborative, not taken over.
Thanks. We might wrap things up. We've got no more questions, and we know Maggie has another engagement at 11. She's very much in demand and professor. So thank you very much, Maggie. That was for for me, who've just been watching on the periphery of this kind of conversation, has been very enlightening. Thank you for putting it together so succinctly for us, and for starting our program of events for the Population Association series with such a fantastic plenary. So thank you very much for coming along and sharing your time and your expertise with us today.
Thank you to everybody who listened today, and thank you for asking the questions. Let's ask more challenging questions of each other. Thank you. Thanks.
And just for everyone who's participating today, this is the first of a series. Our next event is going to be a Meet the Authors panel with Helen Moyle, Leah Rapana and Liz Allen to talk about their recently published books, which will be a really exciting session to attend as well. So sign up for that and we'll see you all there next week. Thank you very much, Maggie.